Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Existential Side Quests. I'm Jenna,
I'm Kimber.
and today we are going to start our big series, not necessarily series, but on Chiron.
Yes, the wounded healer.
Yep. He's actually one of my favorite things in astrology. So,
Jenna's obsessed,
yeah,
but
just a little bit. I have lots of AI photos of us hanging out, and I'm planning to visit Mount Pelion later this month.
what is Mount Pelion for everybody?
It's in Thessaly in Greece, and when Chiron was born, it is in his myth, he was abandoned in a cave at the foot of Mount Pelion. Very sad. I'll just jump right in with that and tell you.
So it's his sacred site, and so Jenna feels very connected to Chiron and is excited to visit.
Yeah, I'm wondering what kind of downloads I'll get when I'm there, but I'll keep you guys.
So Jenna, I just want to say we hear about the wounded healer Chiron as an asteroid, and we can see that in our chart. The symbol is on our thumbnail for today. But you know a lot about the whole myth. It's not just that he was this wounded healer. There's a big backstory. So can you jump into that for us?
Sure, yes. So what happened was his mother, who was a nymph, her name was Philyra, she was in an illicit encounter with Kronos, who's Saturn. And Kronos actually was already in a marriage with Rhea. And when his wife Rhea saw Kronos doing the unthinkable with Philyra, Kronos wanted to not be held accountable, so he transformed himself into a horse. And that the encounter that happened that created Chiron was therefore between this nymph human-like creature and a horse, and thus when Chiron was born, he had the upper body of a human and the lower body from Kronos's shift was a horse. So he appeared like a centaur, but actually he was rejected not only by the humans and the horses but by the centaurs as well, because he wasn't actually really a centaur. He was like this half-breed combination. So he was ridiculed by all the different groups, unfortunately. And he never met his father. His mother was so horrified after this supposedly very painful labor. I can imagine a human trying to deliver a half horse would be very painful, but she was so horrified and disgusted that she abandoned him and never looked back. And he was actually found by Apollo and raised by Apollo and tutored, and actually Chiron really excelled at everything that Apollo put in front of him as far as philosophy went, or medicine, or different healing modalities. Chiron was very wise and a very quick learner from a young age. So Apollo took him under his wing. Chiron excelled at many different things, but ultimately at the same time, there was always that sense of not being good enough, not belonging. He never really fully felt like he fit in anywhere. Whether, even though Apollo is saying like we're together, we have a relationship, like I will support you, I will guide you, there was something underlying that initial wound from not only his creation but from his mother leaving him and his father disowning him, that he never really could move through entirely in his lifetime. However, there were moments where he engaged the truth of his beginnings and the truth of his story, and even just shedding that light through acknowledging his truth offered him some level of comfort.
Yeah. Okay. So, and then Apollo's the god of the sun and poetry and all the things. So then I hear Chiron is outsider energy, able to contribute and give back to the community, excelled in things, but there was still this imposter syndrome, or you're not actually healing the abandonment wound or rejection wound that was existing.
Exactly. And part of Chiron is recognizing that there are certain wounds, such as a Chiron wound, that never really will be completely healed. We can do work on these wounds. We can find meaning. We can find purpose. We can learn to accept these parts of ourselves. There are certain spiritual, behavioral, psychological ways that we can move through our wounding. But as far as like, well, that's behind me and I never have to think about it again, That's not a Chiron wound. That's
Right.
yeah, Chiron wounds withstand time. They come from, they're wounds that we're born with that are we're actually going to leave with as well, and hopefully have done some level of work so that whatever the healing that we did achieve on that wound, on that issue, can reverberate and help other people that have similar wounds, whether it's through direct contact, like such as Chiron taking on disciples or taking on pupils and teaching them, or if it's just through reading about it, or just through the energetic frequency of having a lot of healed people around you.
Yeah. I was thinking a little bit about like physical wounds and how I would compare Chiron if it feels more like a scar or a forever bruise. And was interested in what you were thinking because I can see, if I got a scar from something, there's always going to be this memory connected to it, or and how I manage it will determine if I reopen the scar tissue or if and then we get even more scar tissue on top of scar tissue. And how do I use it? But there's that awareness of that experience getting it could help me be aware, like be able to care for others in a way that I didn't have. But then I was thinking about how are scars and bruises different? And does a Chiron wound feel more like a bruise where it still hurts? Because a scar doesn't necessarily hurt, even if you have that memory of it.
Mm. I actually feel like it could be both, because when you think about bruises, they're very sensitive when you touch them or when you shine light on them, which is what we talk about with shadow work. We're shining light into the darkness to try to really look at what's wrong. And with a bruise, when you start shining light on it, paying attention to it, whether that's through touch or through comparing that part of your body to a different part of your body, you start to really feel, oh, this is a spot that is very tender, that is very sensitive. But with scar tissue, especially if we don't address scar tissue and help it to break up, what can happen is it can become a source of like a stagnant place or somewhere where we can't have the same level of flexibility as other places. So sometimes when we're wounded or when an injury happens, we can be really guarded around it, or we can not want to address it. And that makes it kind of like that. It kind of freezes up and we don't have that same level of, okay, so say I was in, an accident while I was in a car. And then instead of addressing that or facing my fears or trying to move through it, I just avoid cars altogether. Well, my scar tissue in that situation might mean that I basically like don't really leave my house, because now I'm not able to have the flexibility of going places, of transport quite as easily. So I think it's actually both.
Got it. Because then, and yeah, I've heard about like scar manipulation, where when you're massaging the scar, how that can actually like make the scar tissue, you can more malleable, and then the scar actually reduces. So that's a really interesting.
Yeah.
Question.
One of the things with Chiron is we're not trying to make it so that the wound is gone. We're not like, that's never really going to happen. Right. The most we can do is start to tend to the wound, and it's kind of like that solar energy shining light onto that wound. So whether that shining light is literally looking at the problem, or if that is like tending to it by using manual therapies in order to break up that tissue, things like that. There's a lot of metaphor within the idea of shining light, putting intentional attention onto whatever that wound is.
I love that too, because and we can talk a little bit about this, but sometimes Chiron is connected to Aquarius energy, and thinking about shining a light. If you have a physical scar and you don't want to face it, or you don't want to shine a light, you might hide or withdraw and self-isolate, which can be a shadow of Aquarius, instead of being able to kind of own it and like, this is a part of me. And then something else you said was like, so Chiron was very successful, even if he wasn't accepted or approved. And it's just making me think about how sometimes the purpose behind Chiron, or when we think about purpose, sometimes we think purpose and approval or acceptance go together. And it sounds like Chiron fulfilled the purpose, or was able to be this wounded healer, and also didn't get the full acceptance or approval from the community, even though he gave so much as a mentor. And so it's really interesting, because it challenges how, oh, I fulfill my life purpose, then everything's going to feel good, and that there's still this friction or tension is what was a strength and also is always there.
Definitely, definitely. And it's interesting too, where we look at Chiron's story, his entire myth, and how he had that initial wound around the psychological and emotional rejection from both of his parents as well as from society at large. And then later in life, he actually did join the centaurs in the military during a war, and he fought for the centaurs and ended up getting an injury. He was shot in the ankle with an arrow, and for the rest of his life there was some level of evidence of that wound, that secondary physical wound, because he walked with a limp. He was no longer able to balance. That wound from the war had its lasting impact, very much in the same way that that emotional or psychological wound had its lasting impact as well. So we could definitely dissect that even more and think like, well, he was rejected by the entire centaur community at birth. Why was he then turning around and fighting for them? Was that even in his best interest, or was he rising above their behaviors and doing what was best for society? It's hard to pull that apart.
Yeah, because it's like I think what I haven't seen in the myths, and so correct me if I'm missing something, is that once he was wounded in that war, there wasn't this sense of I did all this for nothing.
Mm.
It wasn't around, it was never about needing to save himself, right? Like that's not the motivation. And so it makes me think how sometimes when we can bypass, like the spiritual bypassing and trying to find meaning in the wound, and how we try to skip straight to the gift, and kind of think that might protect us from any further wounds. But we got Pluto, we got Saturn, we have other transits happening where this isn't the only thing that's going on in our lives, and it's just being able to take a harmful experience and turn it into something that can be helpful to others is kind of magical thinking, to think that it would protect you.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And when you think about the fact that Chiron work is at its root about consciousness, about what level of consciousness are you ready to engage your wounding? How much access to deeper thinking can you have around these wounds? Are you still very much in that I am a victim, I am wounded, this is unfortunate, why did this happen to me? If you're still in that very like victimhood, identifying as wounded, it can be very hard to expand your consciousness, to find more meaning, to find more purpose, to see, even though these unfortunate things happened or I have these unfortunate struggles, how can I effectively help myself to show up in other ways and to be productive in other ways that perhaps I couldn't do with these wounds? So for Chiron, he can't necessarily show up in ways that help people understand what it's like to be in a super loving and happy family, because that's not something that he experienced. However, he can show up for the community of people that have similar stories to him, aka similar wounds, and he can provide a source of healing through that connection, through that vibration of, it gets better. I was able to move through this. I'm still here. I shone a light onto my wounds and engaged that shadow. And by engaging that shadow through light, I was able to open this up and find that greater meaning, that greater purpose, that the gifts of what I went through.
Yeah. I think that's important when we start looking at where Chiron is in our birth chart, to think about with the high and the low. And while in Chiron's story, it sounds like for the most part, he operated in the high expression, but thinking about what would the low be, and just specifically he didn't know what it felt like to come from a loving, supportive home, but he also knew how to he maybe had a soft spot for people who were also on the outside or isolated. But if we want to just self-protect and remove ourselves, maybe just further become outcasts, or we can be like, well, I went through this and that's not my problem. So then we can further isolate from a place of wounding. So it's more of if we're operating from the Chiron wound, or have we worked through it and then going into the Chiron healing. And sometimes that, like, it's not just necessarily permanent where I'm automatically and forever going to be in the Chiron healing era versus ever kind of going into the wound.
Yeah, and I think that when we're resentful of what happened to us, it can really get in the way of us moving into those higher levels of consciousness because we're so wrapped up in that level that we're already have access to that we can't really move beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like that you brought up our own natal placements as you know more food for thought on this because as we know, Chiron's a 51-year cycle. So and it is a very weird pattern to it, the elliptical orbit that it moves through. It moves typically in between the orbit of Saturn and Uranus, but it actually at points goes even further out in our solar system than Uranus, as well as further closer to the sun than Saturn. So it's really, we got to think about Jupiter as well and Neptune. And it's almost like the very highest of high expressions of Chiron and Chiron work do push us towards Neptune. And unfortunately, the lowest of the low expressions can push us towards the lower archetypes of Jupiter. And by that, I mean how Jupiter can be associated with that like inner child or that you know the young and the innocent part of us that really doesn't understand at a higher consciousness level what's happening, but we are just that wounded being. Remember that Chiron wounds originate before this lifetime. So the child of ourselves, our childhood, our inner child was aware of these woundings, whether they were being reinforced in behavioral or manifestation echoes into this lifetime or not. There's still that connection with innately understanding what our Chiron placement is in childhood. And as we swing through Saturn, you know, that work that matters, moving through it, you know, getting exhausted from paying so much attention to our wound, and then moving towards Uranus, finding like that higher level of thinking, those higher octaves of Mercury, like what is the real meaning of this? And then we get out to Neptune, and Neptune being about that one consciousness, empathy, connectedness. Oh, it's so beautiful.
You've been like being very tame with your Chiron excitement. I've been very impressed.
I know, I'm trying to not be like everybody.
So Chiron's interesting too because it's also an individual journey and you don't necessarily know where, like, Chiron is kind of different from the planets with are we operating in the wound, and then there's an opportunity for it to turn into healing. So do you cover Chiron with clients the same way each time?
No,
Because it's different from the planets in that way. So I was just curious.
even if it's somebody born like in the same year as somebody else, and like yes, Chiron can, there'll be a day that it changes sign, but typically people around the same age as you have the same Chiron sign, especially if you're near the Aries side of things. So when I see a client that has, you know, a Chiron wound and it's Aries, an Aries Chiron, which is where Chiron is in the sky right now, so this would probably be a client that's around 50 years old, and I see them and we're talking about that wounding around Aries, around vitality, around, you know, the will to be here, that will to live, the right to be here and that right to live, that can show up in all different places based on the houses. So say this person has it in, you know, that arc of intimacy in the 4th through 8th house, that wounding is going to probably show up more in relationship, or whether it's being projected into the relationship or it's a wound that becomes like we're touching the bruise by being in relationship. We're feeling, we're shining light on it and we're not sure how comfortable we are with that by being in, you know, the 4th through 8th house, or someone who has it in like, say it's the 1st or 2nd, and this is more of a personal journey. This is something that's going to be brought up whether they're in relationship or not.
Yeah. Wow.
And then throw in aspects, patterns to it. Like for me, I have Chiron. It's not an Aries. I'm a little younger than that. It's conjunct my moon though. So the idea of there being this emotional lunar component wrapped up in that wounding, or also some intuitive understanding of what it is to have this wound. Again, remember, we want to remember that Chiron has wisdom with it. It has gifts with it. There's a lot really wrapped up in this, and the fact that Chiron is a wound from another lifetime, a wound not necessarily manifested in the here and now, having its own intuitive function to itself, having its own kind of understanding that's a little bit more whimsical than material based, is something that we want to embrace about Chiron rather than run from.
Oh, I love that. That's a great point.
Someone asked us to turn on closed caption. Yes, I can do that, I think.
I'm glad you can.
I might have just overpromised. I'm going to keep poking at this, but I will definitely thank you for that request, and I will definitely figure this out by
Yeah.
next time for sure.
Yes, and if we can't get it today, we should definitely think about that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to stop poking around at it.
So would you say that the house or the sign or is more powerful? It's definitely the house is definitely more personal for Chiron since Chiron moves somewhat slow.
Yeah. I think honestly it really depends on the chart. Like in the same way that, you know, the Pluto and Scorpio generation, we all have that same Pluto and Scorpio placement, and there's definitely a through line for all of us 80s and first half of 90s babies. But it's so deep, we can't just all be in one group. And even if you and I had the same house placement and sign placement, the aspects are, you know, telling a completely different story.
I was going to say that too. I feel like the aspects are very important with Chiron.
I see a person asking for the closed caption again. I don't know how to exactly turn it on. We are going to definitely try to figure that out for next time, though. I'm sorry about that. I wish there was an easy way to do this. We will find that out. We have a production meeting tonight, so
yes,
that's
I think that's a great question to bring up
for the production meeting. Yeah. So what do you think, Kimber? Have you worked a lot with Chiron with your clients?
Yes, and I think I love Ceres and I love Chiron. I love all the asteroids, and because we don't have a lot of time together, I really like to look at which ones are most prominently placed and feel, is this Chiron feeling really strong if that's something we should cover in our time together. But I'm always looking at where Chiron is in someone's chart. I know that in our evolutionary astrology, sometimes people talk about maybe Chiron, Pluto, and Saturn being connected, or they can also speak to different types of wounds. And so I do like to see, is this Chiron adding something new to the possible wounds or the past life story, or is it kind of writing something down in ink and really driving the same point home? So it's interesting. But yeah.
Definitely. I see Jill is sharing that her Chiron is in her 6th house in Leo opposite Saturn. Wow, that's interesting because we were talking a little bit before about how Chiron's orbit is between Saturn and Uranus. So having an aspect with one of those two planets really hones in that side of the Chiron kind of equation here. And we know oppositions tend to play out externally, at least when we're behaviorally observing them. So perhaps, Jill, you can say if how this comes out, but having that Chiron wound in the 6th house in Leo, there's a wound around being seen, a wound around letting your true vulnerability be shown. And then in the 6th house, is that in day-to-day, in work environments, in places where you potentially could be passing on information to people? Is there a doubting your own ability, is your own knowledge of different routines or different work, different things in your life, daily habits even, and then opposing Saturn. So that's going to be opposing from the 12th house. Like there's that blockage. So somebody else coming in, maybe it's almost like this mystical blockage, this person who represents kind of like this, or you're allowing them to represent this wall around how much power you actually have, a wall around like, I can't step into myself because that person's already stepped in. That person already knows better than me. It could be energy like that playing out.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because if it's a Leo Chiron, it's opposite an Aquarius Saturn, right? And so it's Aquarian energy. I'm also interested because I've been looking at 6th house, 12th house Chiron with opposite Saturn or opposite Saturn and Uranus. And I feel like I also see some generational curse breaking situation too, where there's this like that there's a wound within those 6th house type of relationships, like what this reciprocity, and with Leo, a wound around being seen or the recognition. And so I could see that being like, are we if we're in the shadow, like, are we overperforming or trying or not trying to have needs and like giving a lot and a lot, not being seen, kind of making ourselves invisible? Or are we on the other side of just really leaning into our own needs and not being, and kind of like thinking of it from a scarcity mindset as well?
Mm. I like the performative side of Leo being tied into. It almost makes me think too that there could be a defense mechanism around if someone does ask you like, "Oh, how are you doing?" You're like, "Well, I'm only going to complain about the things that are okay to complain about." Like
Yeah.
I'll play those things up rather than what I really want to answer, what my truth is.
Because that's that vulnerability is when we're working through. And I could totally see where, if you are going with the healing gift of, you could be very aware of other people's needs or wanting them to be vulnerable and being able to praise and recognize them for being able to find that balance and not necessarily still struggling with doing that yourself.
Definitely. And that's kind of where that whole cycle of like wounded healer kind of comes in. So if Jill was particularly struggling with this, not saying that you are or you aren't, Jill, you'll have to tell us yourself. But if Jill was particularly struggling with this wound around being vulnerable, this wound around letting her truth kind of show, and she saw somebody else come into her life that was actually doing a great job of being vulnerable, that person is almost like that healing energy of, oh, that's what it looks like to be vulnerable and kind of sit in that discomfort. And oh my gosh, look, this person survived. Because ultimately what we're talking about with Chiron is wounds that kind of don't feel survivable. As maybe ridiculous as that kind of sounds, like there's some level of, ooh, this is threatening to my very sense of groundedness here on this earth. Like there's something about this wound that feels dangerous. There's something about this situation, this opportunity, this boundary, whatever I'm coming up against, that ultimately feels like I no longer have a place here, which is what Chiron was facing.
I'm going to push with that though,
Yeah.
because when you said survivable, that makes the wound sound really intense. And in evolutionary astrology, sometimes, like, Stephen Forrest kind of compares it to a toothache, and then Pluto's more like not survivable.
Mm-hmm.
So can you build more on that?
Yes, definitely. The thing with Pluto is I feel like Pluto wounds feel like they're not survivable because the psychological intensity and the depth
Mm-hmm.
of shadow that's coming up feels like hell has come upon us.
Right.
Whereas with Chiron, I think it's almost like our life force energy has just kind of been depleted. Like there's this sense of like it's more of like the out breath that never stops, that like, oh, I can't do it anymore, that side of things. That's the feel that I get with Chiron's inability to kind of move on, the feeling that I'm not going to survive this. It's not the total annihilation of Pluto, or even with Uranus, we could talk about like that, like sudden shocking, like, oh my gosh, like traumatic instantaneousness. Chiron's more subtle than Uranus. It's
Mm-hmm.
less like slamming than Pluto, but it's like a toothache. It's kind of like always just there gnawing at you. And eventually you're just like, do I even want to do this anymore? Like, this is just too much.
Okay.
So
So
draining.
like that's just getting poking at you.
Like the bruise
Mhm.
situation.
Yeah. No, and I was thinking about the scar tissue too. Just kind I was trying to figure out an analogy with that of just, it's when it's kind of brushed up against, it's reopening. It's not just that new wound, it's bringing back a lot of other things. And then when there's more scar tissue, it takes more to cut through.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely. Definitely. And the longer you let something kind of go, the longer that we don't address something, the harder it can get. Like how many people do we know that, oh, my leg's hurting, but I'll just walk it off. I'll wait a couple days, and then a couple days turns into a couple weeks, turns into a couple months, and then all of a sudden it's not just part of their leg anymore. It's thrown off their entire gait, and now their back hurts, and it's gone all the way up. There's like fascia tightening and all this. So it's like when we don't address our Chiron wounds, that can be what ends up happening. Like our new level of normal has this discomfort, this dis-ease that then starts to manifest in the body as disease. And
Mm.
which is kind of the beauty of Chiron having that 51-year cycle, because around age 49 to 51, the universe sets it up again. Chiron comes back in the sky, a wounding on top of our wounding, almost saying like, hey, have you done this work? Have you been shining light on these wounds so that you can try to heal them as much as possible, so that you can find the wisdom in them, so that you can find the gifts of these wounds? And if you haven't, then it's almost like you don't have any tools to deal with the wound coming back around and being highlighted again. And it can feel like this urgent crisis around, oh, these issues that I don't even know where they stem from. Because remember, these are this lifetime wounds that are being activated. It can feel like a crisis that we really were completely unprepared for and can't quite articulate very well. And that's when it becomes even more important during a Chiron activation. And the universe will hold our hand through this in some ways, synchronicities, that we have those healers, those people who have been through this before, in order to show us that there is a way through.
I like that.
Camille commented that her Chiron is in the 5th house in Cancer. She doesn't know what that means, but if she had to reflect on her wounds, they seem centered around motherhood and freedom.
That is great. And I want to ask something before that, because my Chiron's also in Leo opposite Saturn, but it's in the 10th house. And so I was wondering if, I feel like I know the answer, but I'm trying to, and then I feel that I know that Jillian is a teacher and I was a teacher as well. And I feel like that really connects with that Saturn. But just, do you feel when you have this Chiron wound that events are kind of coming up that are trying to push you to not ignore the ache? So mine's in 10th house, it's intercepted, and people are always surprised to hear I hate public speaking. It's so uncomfortable for me. They're like, oh, you're so good at it, or why? You're a teacher. But there will always be these opportunities. I remember I was nominated to do this speech, and the first thing I said was, no, I don't want to do this. But now I have to do it. And so I feel like there's these things, these challenges that kind of come up of, I have choices to be able to, am I going to go and do this speech, or am I going to put myself out there? Or there were also things where when I'm doing public speaking, something happened that would like not go, it wasn't perfect, or I wasn't being seen the way I wanted to be seen, to some fashion mistake or something. It was ridiculous. But it's just, I'm wondering if other people feel like where their Chiron is, do you feel like life kind of serves these opportunities to either rub against your Chiron wound, but also trying to push you into the healer phase? Because I feel very sensitive to my students when I was a teacher, of making sure that there was an on-ramp to public speaking of, okay, we're going to practice in small groups first, or then we're going to make sure we group this so we don't lose our place. And then, the audience is learning how to be a supportive audience. And so I was very aware of, I don't want you to have a negative experience with this. And if you're not sure what to say, we can, like, here's what we can do, or figure it out. But I didn't get there until I had some pretty embarrassing and like humiliating experiences publicly first.
Yeah. I think even engaging those experiences, even if they were humiliating or there were some bumps along the way, that's really the medicine, because you were in essence shining the light onto the wound by engaging it, by saying, I'm going to try this even though it's difficult. And as you're up on that stage saying things, it's almost like exposure therapy in a way. It didn't really matter if the audience was positive or negative. There was going to be a dose of something that was going to be negative, whether it was, the fashion faux pas, or, a lighting, something
yeah.
coming up.
And kind of bringing me to what Camille was saying, and just that centered around motherhood and freedom. And Camille, you can share if you'd like, but just thinking about like what experiences in your life kind of point to that, of to be able to kind of lean in and shine a light. And when you said shine a light, it's just so interesting because Apollo took Chiron in, and Apollo is one of the sun gods. So just really kind of where sometimes Chiron can shine the light on you of, hey, are you going to pay attention to this and lean in, or are you going to lean away?
So good. Yes, definitely. It is so funny to see the symbolism of Apollo, because it's also interesting that there's so many slight variations on the Chiron myth. Like certain people, emphasize different points of the myth as the most important details of it, or this was the moment when Chiron was really doing his work, or this was just the manifestation of this part of the Chiron myth. And it goes to show you it's a perfect representation for the fact that so much of Chiron is about perception and how we are perceiving our stories, our wounding, our healing, our entire journey. And if we're still sitting in a place of perceiving ourselves as wounded and victimized and unable to act autonomously without sovereignty, without any of those gifts or those that those resources that we really do have and we can call in, if we're in a place where we can't perceive those or we reject those as part of our toolkit, then we're very much limited by that. So it's kind of like the lenses with which people share the story of Chiron kind of give you a hint as to their own experience with Chiron and with their own wounding and how they've moved through it.
It's such a good point.
Yeah, I really like that. I like that a lot. The thing with Chiron that I think we get really caught up on is, oh, in order to be the healer, I have to be healed. And that is simply not true.
Yeah. And this is kind of bringing me back to the healing journey, ego trip discussion that we had with, there's also an alternative from the victim mentality and going into where this didn't happen. I don't want to perceive this at all. So I'm going to kind of avoid anything that reminds me of this. And you can't actually step into the healer or mentor if you're not willing to kind of integrate, if you just want to forget or just detach completely from that. And so I think that that's also a shadow of Chiron where it won't be activated, or it's almost dormant. So it can feel like a missed opportunity. And so I just wanted to kind of throw that out there.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, because going with that same analogy of shining light, if instead of not shining light at all, you're like, I'm actually turning off and taking out the batteries, we're done with light, we're not looking at this at all. It's like, well, then what level of consciousness are you going to raise? You've plateaued yourself. You need to acknowledge the truth, acknowledge the darkness, acknowledge the icky parts, the shadow. You need to acknowledge that in order to shed light on it. And then the shedding light on it allows us to mindfully and meaningfully incorporate that wounded side of ourselves, bring it to the table, invite, little you, damaged you, terrified you, the part of you that you don't want other people to see. It's inviting that part of ourselves to the table in order for us to integrate, learn to love that part of yourself, learning to love that part of your story, learning to love it for what it actually afforded you down the road. The connections it bestowed, the healing, even the levels of consciousness that are opened up when we engage shadow work. It's interesting to think of it as like, well, Chiron's first wound of just being abandoned at the bottom of the mountain, and then his next wound and the wounds after that, and we could talk about the wound of his ankle and things like that. It's pointing to the fact that all of our wounds are not like one dimensional. It's not like, oh, there's the wound and we're done. It's like once you start engaging consciousness, it starts opening up more and more and more. You start seeing where this wound has manifested in other areas of your life. So like with Camille saying that, reflecting on your wound centered around motherhood and freedom. I always felt misunderstood by my mom, even knowing how loved and unneglected I was. And now as a mom, you're kind of going against the grain. So it's informing you. There's some parallels there. I was the same. I home birthed my kids and homeschooled them because of my own woundedness and wanting to protect them from it. But then once I started to realize, oh, I'm parenting my children in a way that I needed to be parent, not necessarily, and I'm not saying this is you, Camille, but not necessarily in a way that my kids need to be parent. And now I'm kind of loosening the reins and turning that same attention that I was giving to my children. Now I have practice with holding space like that. And now I can actually turn it inward and hold space like that for myself. So it's like bringing these journeys. Oh, all children should be XYZ. Well, maybe actually now I'm noticing that there's a diversity of unique needs here. Oh, maybe what I was actually saying was I needed that. And now I'm finally safe to say that it was me that needed that. I'm safe to address my inner child.
Can I speak about your Chiron, Jenna?
Yeah.
So your Chiron is in what sign?
Gemini in the third.
In the third house. conjunct your moon. But
Mhm.
something when you were just saying that, it was making me think about, Gemini is the sign of learning. And you were just like how you're able to kind of advocate for people to get the learning supports that they need, or how much you care about homeschooling because you didn't feel like you had that. And it's just like that outsider experience in education. I don't want to say much more, but it's just like, it's kind of interesting to see how your Chiron's playing into that.
Mm.
And I think with Camille, with the home births and homeschooling the mom, and it's like we see Chiron in Cancer and then in the fifth house. And what I like too, Camille, is just that you are also, I know that you are using your voice and like on other platforms and talking about like critiquing the family and how we are kind of compromising certain things. And so you are to kind of fit into a nuclear family that doesn't always serve the needs of each individual in it. And that's really powerful. But it's like really being able to kind of take our experiences and be comfortable still kind of being the outsider or the questioner, being able to challenge us to improve, because it's still Chiron's still very much motivated by progress and humanity. And so it's not like you are being the outsider questioning to kind of destroy something that is good. It's really, if you are destroying something or if you are going against it, it's because you know that it could be better, or
Mm.
there's like a missed perspective. So it's just really interesting to see in both of your stories.
It's also interesting to think about this as in terms of the primary planets that Chiron is kind of dancing between, Uranus and Saturn. It's almost like these epiphanies, this bringing it out, the greater good, the seeing things differently than other people, very Aquarian, very future focused. And then when we have that insight, pulling it back into Saturn, into the discipline, the work over time, the really sticking to the things that matter. Well, I had this insight in my Uranian space of Chiron, and now I'm going to bring it back over here, and I'm going to put sustained effort into making that a reality. And that's the whole Saturn. Do you want to be exhausted or depressed? Well, I definitely don't want to be depressed about my Chiron wound. So now that I have this wisdom around what it looks like to work on it, I'm going to go to Saturn and I'm going to put in this effort. And then when that effort starts to feel like, okay, I've done a lot, and then maybe we can lean back over into Uranus and check in again and be like, well, what wisdom am I seeing now? What future focused opportunities are aligned for me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Which is why it's so interesting to see the many levels of how Chiron shows up. Like in my chart, when I look at it, and the first people that ever talked to me about it were like, this is a wounding in around mother, because we have the moon conjunct Chiron, mother moon, Chiron wound, a wound around mother. Okay. Yes, that's fair. That's part of my story. But then to hear, we could also talk about this as a wound around learning and a wound in education and a wound in having accessibility to these things. It's like, yeah, that was absolutely a part of my story too.
Yeah. And that's why it's so you just said earlier how not every Chiron in the same sign is going to connect, but it's not just, you could have another Chiron and Gemini conjunct the moon and it could be around voice. I just know from talking with you that yours can also tie into that education. And so just being open to, just because I described my Chiron wound in Leo the way I did doesn't mean everyone with Leo has the same thing, because we know there's different archetypes connected to every sign and to every house. And so you'd want to look at the whole chart as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because I've given readings to people with Gemini Chirons before, and so many of them have to do with the energy of that like scatteredness, or a sense of everything feeling unpredictable or out of control. And it kind of challenged me reflectively to be like, is this something that I struggle with too? And I was like, yeah, maybe it actually is the struggle with transitions, especially like, this is going to sound ridiculous, but third house short trips, leaving my house, the level of dysfunction around the 10 minutes before I have to leave to go somewhere, whether it's me zoning out or me trying to fit 3 hours worth of chores into that 10 minutes, like that's part of it too. And if I was in a place where that was the level of consciousness that I could handle to engage my Chiron, then that's the Chiron work I'm doing. But for me, it's a lot of it is around that learning and advocating for my own kids and their learning differences, but then also advocating in the adoption community and the displaced and trafficked people's community. It's like, these are the levels of consciousness that I'm engaging on at this point. Maybe there'll come a time in the future where I'm like, I really need to start like tackling the fact that I have really scattered energy around transitions. But for whatever reason, that was not the first thing that I looked at with my Chiron.
No, I like that though, because I think even with what Camille's saying, there's different things. Like then she was able to support other women who are interested in a home birth. And so it's not, it's like maybe is it that we have multiple Chiron wounds, or do they all kind of come from the same Chiron wound? Because I was also thinking about, my Chiron's opposite Saturn. So, and Saturn's a blockage. And so another part of my Leo 10th house Chiron wound, it does connect to when I went through my divorce. That felt very difficult because it felt public and I didn't want to be seen in that way. But that might have added to that Leo because it's tied into my 4th house Aquarius Saturn as well. And 4th house being connected to family and home. So now somewhere that I already have a blockage has now become really public. And it's just, and it still kind of still connects to that public speaking, but it's really that there's this theme of it's hard to be seen and be vulnerable, and that it would be easier if I'm just performing this version because that feels safer. And so I'm like, I can see it, maybe that all connects, but I also feel that I was still working with a part of my Chiron wound when I was a teacher and working through my public speaking. And then there's still more. And so it's not necessarily that you solve Chiron and you figured out this one angle, because there's going to be other angles that kind of pop up as you get more and more curious, or I think more aware and integrating your chart. You just start to see how much further you can go.
Which it brings us back to that consciousness. Like it's all about how big of a level of consciousness are you, higher levels of consciousness. Where have you come to that you can actually start to see how everything really is just interconnected? It's all part of the same story.
Yeah, I love that. Can you talk, I think you about more around the solarizing aspect of Chiron, because I keep thinking about that awareness and how important, how our sun might connect into that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, okay, so when we look at Chiron and we look at the parts of ourselves that are wounded, these are almost like the dark corners of ourselves. These are the parts of ourselves that feel very vulnerable, in the same way that like when we have a wound, even if the bandage isn't helping it, when we cover it, it feels protected. When we really engulf it with darkness, it starts to feel okay, it's at least protected. We don't have to really go there. We can ignore that giant gash on our leg because we can't see it. We're not as sensorily connected to it. So when we start to shine light on our wounds, whether that's by talking about it, whether that's by a synchronistic action that reminds us of it, whether that's by witnessing someone else with a similar wound, mirroring it back to us, those are all ways that we're solarizing or shining light onto that wound. So Apollo being one of the gods of the sun, showing up for Chiron, it's interesting to think of him like getting Chiron out of that cave and essentially shining light on, hey, I'm here because you were left. Like he immediately was shining light on Chiron's wound. Chiron's biggest trauma to that moment was now on display for everyone to see, because Chiron was with this person who was not his mother or his father and he had no ambiguity in this. He was like a centaur being raised by Apollo. It made no sense. But it was almost like he couldn't escape the fact that his wounds were on display. He couldn't escape the fact that the sun was there shining light. So what was he going to do? He either had to address it. I guess he could have dissociated from it. The other thing he could have done, and it kind of reminded me of your story a little bit, was like, if you didn't want anyone knowing your business or seeing that side of it, it's like you could have become a complete hermit and like completely rejected society and hidden yourself away. But again, that's not with light. That's with shadow. That's covering that wound. That's allowing that wound to just sit there and kind of turn. Is it gangrene? Is that
right? Because you need to let wounds breathe. There needs to be some air, and at some point it needs to scab. And it can't scab if we're always keeping it covered. It just stays open and gross.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
and you know, when you get like a cast off your arm and you're like, "Oh, like as much as the doctor said my bones healed, like my it feels really weak." Like we need to reacclimate to what it is to show this side of
Mhm.
ourselves, to show our wound, let it build up some resistance to the elements, to the judgment of other people, to the voices of other people, to the solarizing, other people shining a light. Like when people say like, "Oh, don't stare at someone that has a visible difference than you." It's like that's essentially what you're doing. You're solarizing that difference. You're
Mhm.
shining light on it. And yes, we're saying partly that that's necessary, but it's really up to us to shine that light on our wounds, or the people that are our trusted guides in our life, like Apollo being, you know, the childhood guardian of Chiron. Yes, he had a right to sit there and kind of shine that light on him. Otherwise, Chiron wouldn't have survived. But
Yeah.
shining light on other people's wounds, I've said this for a while now, you can't pull people through their trauma. It needs to be consensual. You can't shine light. Oh, that's your Chiron wound coming up. Someone would be very thrown by that.
Yes. And Chiron's such a different, it's a little bit easier to ignore, I think, than other wounds until you're ready. Like, and
Mhm.
you can't force someone to engage with their Chiron in the way that you are engaging, or force the same like timing as well, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. Because honestly, when people ignore their Pluto wounds, the psychological impact of that is
You know,
very
back around. Like it's like you know, it'll be like, okay, you're not ready right now, but I know this next transit will make it hard to ignore.
absolutely. And then they become further and further disconnected from psychological peace. And in that, the wound needs to be
I see
tended.
it. Mm-hmm.
But with Chiron, it's almost like similar to Chiron getting shot in the foot. Like how many people walk around limping nowadays? How many people walk around limping and ignoring it? Well, how many people walk around with a Chiron limp? You can't
Yeah.
really see a Chiron limp, but there's a lot of Chiron limps walking around. People, oh, this is this annoyance. I know that things aren't going, you know, emotionally, behaviorally, physically, spiritually as smoothly as they could be going, but you know, I'll just keep moving through it until perhaps their Chiron return, perhaps some other type of activation of their Chiron wound, perhaps Chiron in the sky coming around, hitting something in their chart, showing them like, hey, we're going to feel wounded in a new way. We're going to feel, right now it's an Aries, we're going to feel wounded in an Aryan way. How can that then inform your natal Chiron and the wisdom from working with
Yep.
transiting Chiron, bringing that back home? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it's just, I feel I'm hearing Chiron's really around belonging,
Mhm.
not but like still participating or engaging in community, even if it's not fully connected to an inner feeling of acceptance. And
Mhm.
so, and if we're going to the shadow, it could be we're either trying to force belonging and bypass that feeling, or we're just choosing not to engage at all, or kind of identify as the outcast.
Yeah. Like projecting it outwards too. Like,
Mhm.
oh, it's everyone's fault for being a bully at me. It's not I feel like I don't belong because these people make me feel that way. And it's
Right.
like that can be true, but you also need to recognize your autonomy in that situation. Are there new groups you can join? Is there a different way you can invest your time and energy within the group you're already in? Do you want to try reinventing yourself and showing up in a different way? What
Yeah.
about not caring? What about
Yeah, there's a balance because like you don't like antisocial is maybe not the answer, but then also you don't want it's not about you don't want to be desperate for people to accept you because it's about standing in this is my experience. And I do you were saying too of I just want to name like you can't just let the wound scab until you've let it heal. So sometimes you're going to need to wrap it up in a bandage. I think whenever I was like feeling publicly, so much was happening in my life publicly, I did need to go inward for a second. I did need to pull back. I needed to regroup there. And I could feel the time when it was ready to start putting myself out there again publicly and making sure I didn't want to feel that I was focused on performing happiness or life is good. I was like, I want this to feel authentic. I'm ready to do this, even though it's uncomfortable. I'm going to push myself. And so I think I just want to make sure that everyone's giving themselves time to, you're going to want to have the bandage wrapped sometimes, but there is like this weird turning point where, okay, we might be keeping it on too long and then we're kind of adding to the infection or we're not letting the thing heal.
Yeah, similar to Cancer energy. When we talk about like the Cancerian energy that expends itself to everyone else first and doesn't take time for itself, to use that healing, that rejuvenating energy on self, but instead gives it away to everybody else. It's like that with Chiron too. And I honestly see it in a lot of healer charts, clients that are either nurses or doctors or work in the metaphysical healing realm. I'm like, these clients tend to be a demographic that has not prioritized their Chiron for all the reasons that we've talked about, because it's more subtle. And they're like, well, my job, I'm helping all these people all day long. And you get that sense of, I have done my healing work because I'm healing all these other people. But then there's still some wounding under there. And it leads to this sense of like, I'm running in circles and I'm feeling burnt out, even though I'm still really good at my job. So it's confusing.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I feel like the opportunities to engage with Chiron can feel, like you said, subtle. And I'm just thinking too of how even inviting me to consider doing the show, that was a Chiron opportunity to lean back into. Like I was already, it was timed up perfectly with where I said, okay, I will start doing things out in public again. But I was feeling an internal, like, I don't know. And then this came up, and your Chiron's on my South Node. So it's just really interesting how but I think I didn't recognize that was a Chiron moment until after the fact. And then we were actually talking about putting this together, and I was like, I can feel it. But so I could have just said, never mind, I don't want to do this anymore.
Yeah.
But okay, I'm going to work through that discomfort. And still, even if it's uncomfortable, I'm still going to participate or work with this placement.
Yeah. Kudos on your Chiron.
Just people living astrologers are not safe.
Right? Exactly.
Yeah.
The one thing I love when Stephen talks about how you don't really need to know, Stephen Forrest talks about how you don't need to know astrology to work your astrology. Like you'll meet someone who's never done their chart, but they're successful, and you pull their chart and you're like, yep, you're working it. It works the other way too. Like just because we know astrology doesn't mean we're like nailing everything. So.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I'm really excited for us to explore later the Chiron return, because I do think that does sound, from what I've read from Judy, is just that in sacred psychiatry that it can feel plutonic, the Chiron return.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know what's wild too is that the Chiron return, 51-year cycle, 51 being a septile of the sun, and the fact that the sun is such a big part of Chiron shining that light. So it feels like there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
Like, there's strings to pull together there.
Another side quest.
Right? I know. I'm going to have to like really jam on that for a minute before we talk about that.
I'm so excited. Is there anything else you wanted to say? We have 3 minutes.
I love Chiron.
I know we had so much to talk about, and I feel like we covered a lot, but I feel like, is there anything else?
I think that was about it. It's interesting. Whenever I read a book about Chiron, it's so easy to see your own story within how someone else explains Chiron. And that kind of just shows us that higher purpose of Chiron, which is that one consciousness, which is that connecting everyone together, ultimately showing us that like even within the hardships there is meaning. Let's find it. Let's find that bridge to connection. Even within this person's woundedness or this person's presentation of their Chiron wound, once we all kind of come together and recognize that the wisdom and the work that each one of us does is impacting that universal consciousness all on its own, that we all really do benefit from the healing work that those of us do around us. So let's all lift and support each other as much as we can.
That was so beautiful.
Aw, thanks.
Okay, so where are we going next week?
Do you want to do Chiron return, and do you think we could roll Ceres into it too, or no?
Do you want to try and do Ceres versus Chiron, or just moving Chiron? I'd love, if anyone's in the chat, I would love to hear what you think. If we should stay with moving Chiron and in the chart and transiting, or do we want to go into Ceres versus Chiron?
Thanks, Christine.
Thanks, Christine. That was like a perfect ending, Jenna.
I know. We'll make a little like clip out of it. Like a short.
Yeah.
We know the lingo here. All right,
Yep.
return. It's looking
Mhm.
like return.
I think that that would be great. And then we can talk about moving Chiron because Chiron's moving into Taurus in June.
Mm-hmm.
That will be our last episode
Yeah,
for
well.
6 weeks.
Yeah. So we hope everyone can join us next week for our final episode before our 6 week break.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you all for being here, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.